Welcome to the second in a series of podcasts inspired by DuPree's blog post titled The DevOps Entry Point, Context, Maturity, Then Metrics. In the initial podcast, we talked about the early IT pioneers and how they shaped our approaches and perceptions, both good and bad. Our intent was to help our listeners develop a context and understanding of why so many organizations are taking this journey towards DevOps and adopting agile practices. Because it's important to understand not just the what we're doing and how we do it, but also understand the why we're doing it. In this second podcast, we'll discuss the first steps to take on that DevOps journey and how to establish the foundation for success. Welcome to Agile Advocate Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Drew. Today I have back in the studio Al DuPree, former Director of Innovation at NIST and Chief Information Officer for the Congressional Budget Office. Welcome back to the podcast, Al.
It's great to be back, Bill. Thank you.
So, Al, for all of those who missed the first podcast, give us a brief recap of your background.
I am an IT professional for the last 30 some odd years, 25 of which I've known you. Started out in Big 6, Big 8 consulting, worked at a couple Fortune 500s, and in fact, I've started my own businesses before I moved into the government space. 14 years at Congressional Budget Office, and then a couple at NIST, and there we go.
So, the disclosure you get kind of out of the way, which is good.
Yeah.
25 plus years, and work with each other. So if you hear some innuendos and some inside jokes, that's where they call it.
Absolutely.
Before we jump into the second podcast, give our listeners a recap of what we talked about in the first one.
Well, so it's been a subject of mine and a matter of interest for some time. And that's how do we go about organizing both the way IT is structured as well as organizing how we go about doing or trying to do what we're tasked with doing. So one of the things that's impressed me is that in many ways, the history, the prior influences of the marketplace have been responsible for the way we structure information technology, the way we approach it. That's neither good nor bad. It just is. The marketplace has what's generally referred to as a random walk. It's not going to come to the best or most efficient solution immediately. And in this case, it didn't. In the early days, the IBMs of the world and the Arthur Andersons of the world and such influenced the way we go about doing what we do in ways that were to our detriment. Now that we understand that, the question is, how do we take control of our own destiny and how do we change the direction?
Good recap. In this second blog post, you referenced my favorite framework, CAMS, or CALMS, or even better yet, camels. Because when you put the M before the L, you measure and then you lean. But measuring, leaning, sharing. But nonetheless, it really speaks about culture and organization first. So you talk about DevOps being as much of how we organize it, you just said, the IT function?
Absolutely.
But also how we incentivize people with the technologies that we select and how we go about organizing them and motivating them.
Yes. So any goal-seeking organization, whether it be for profit or whether it be to construct something, an architectural firm, a construction company, any goal-seeking organization needs to take into account what the incentives are. Ultimately, we behave according to the incentives. It's easiest to see with the folks who work in sales and marketing. If I incentivize you to behave in specific ways toward my customer base, ultimately you can bet that that individual is going to behave in that fashion. The trick is, am I designing those incentives in ways that create the behaviors and the outcomes that I want? In the case of IT, that hasn't been the case. In the instance of IT, that hasn't been the case. What do I mean by that? Well, in the early days, we talked about essentially two parameters that determined whether or not information technology was considered to be successful. Those two parameters were time and budget. And essentially they're kind of restatements of each other, but that's another story. Time and budget decided whether or not we were going to be successful. So I looked at you as an application manager or an infrastructure manager. And I said to you, I want what you're supposed to deliver to me as it stands right now in place at this specific time for this specific amount of money. And then I started to change everything about what it is I told you I wanted. And I also changed the personnel involved, and I likely changed even the customer. But I still maintained the proposition that it has to be at this time and for this amount of money. And the incentives, as such, tended to drive some very interesting cultural kinds of artifacts. The first of which is applications and infrastructure and QA and help desk and all of the other kind of generic functions within IT. They operate solely for their own survival. They do not consider themselves part of a whole. They rather consider themselves as individual stovepipes. And as such, if it's necessary for me to work at cross purposes with you, then that's what I'll do.
I think you would probably describe them better as tribes.
Tribes works as well. I don't have any issue with that whatsoever.
And they're all in their corner.
And their fights over water rights and hunting privileges break out routinely. All you need to do then is add the 800-pound gorilla on the block these days, which is security, and then you've got a riot on your hands. So the incentives that we put into place have driven the organization into their own specific corners, where they look at each other and at the organization they serve as often hostile entities. We're not operating as one cohesive whole. We're not 5 fingers on a hand. It's more like 3 toes, 2 fingers, and an eyelash. I mean, they are disparate pieces, and they are pursuing their own interests.
And we budget that way too.
We do. And in fact, sometimes we even create instances in which the tribes go to war over scarce resources.
So talk to me about the relationship of agile practices and DevOps. Sometimes you'll see people go, no, I don't want agile. I just want DevOps. Or the people start talking DevOps and you'll talk about agile and they'll kind of give you a crooked look like, I thought we were talking about a different thing. Talk to me about the relationship there.
I think of and have become a proponent of DevOps because I think of it as an extension or an overlay to the agile approach to the development of application software. The agile approach, in a nutshell, strips away all of the madness that was created inside of the waterfall methodologies, strips that away and takes the whole notion of command and control and highly centralized and very large deliverables out of the equation, and instead provides for people to incrementally deliver products that we agree to in an incremental fashion. Now, what that does is it reduces risk substantially. It provides an opportunity for pivots in projects because the assumption is that we may not know everything up front. And it allows for the commitment of resources on an incremental basis as well. I don't try and budget a project for years in advance or even months. I budget the project in a scope and a frame that allows me to designate a minimally viable product and evaluate whether that MVP is appropriate and answers the questions we think it does. Now, DevOps overlaid on top of that says simply this. From a cultural point of view, we all need to be focused and engaged in delivering this product. The enterprise has said, this is important to me. This, whatever I am concocting, is important. We all need to coalesce around it and understand that each of us have a role in delivering that to the enterprise. As such, we're not at odds or competing. We are now looking at one another not to point fingers, but to accept responsibility, to assume responsibility for the delivery of a product to the enterprise. And that product is not just application software. That product is wrapped with all manner of supporting services. If I don't have the appropriate QA in place, I don't have an application. If I don't have the appropriate help desk in place, I don't have an application. If the infrastructure isn't capable, if the database administration function hasn't supported, I don't have an application. It's a product, many moving parts that have to be delivered as a whole.
And then you can see how that flies right in the face of an ops maintenance O&M function where they're like, I'm sorry, but you really think that you're going to be in production? That's my domain. That's what I do. I don't understand how that's all going to work.
Back when I was part of a manufacturing concern called Black & Decker, I came to realize just how much at odds the folks that put their hands and wrenches on things are with the folks who stare at screens all day are, and the help desk people who are in the middle. At the end of the day, we often create a set of circumstances in which those people stare at one another across the table and attempt to impose their will on one another. In particular, if the culture of the organization as a whole is under inordinate competitive pressure, it just translates down and inside. I am of the opinion that we've got an amazing opportunity here at the beginning of this, the first 20 years of this new century, to reverse that, to establish an example for the rest of the organization as to how we overcome that tribal instinct and operate as one. Because let's face it, it's becoming an increasingly competitive world, and we need to operate as such.
Oh, for the 1950s, huh? So you say really that it's more of a strategy.
So it's a strategy, yes. There's no question about it.
And not really a methodology.
No, it is most definitely not a methodology. Absolutely. And perhaps there's tremendous confusion with that. And again, the market is trying to encroach upon our ability to define this for ourselves.
In what way?
The whole notion of DevOps in a box, or DevOps related services, or DevOps methodologies, or
God tell you, if I get that product, I'm going to sell it.
And DevOps is the latest buzzword. And ultimately, we have once again the market looking to define this for us. I think it's fair to say, having worked both the consulting side of the desk as well as the client side of the desk, that it's immensely important right now for the client side to close ranks. There's a place for vendors. There's a place for contractors. There's a place for consultants. They always bring value. But at this point, we need desperately to keep them in their lane and to establish the definition of this for ourselves.
I can't tell you how relevant that statement is, because there are so many people that are going to the meeting. They hear DevOps, somebody says DevOps, they all clap as if they're in some strange
evangelical meeting.
Yeah, something like that. I was going to use another one, but that works. And they come out of it and they all look at each other going, yes, DevOps, that's going to be good. And then they come over and they ask, what is that DevOps thing? So relevancy on that is amazing. There's an incredible number of clients in our portfolio are doing just that. They're asking, okay, as you say, it's dark 30 here.
Yes.
What's my first step?
So the proposition I have for most who would take that step is to start with a simple cultural change. And that kind of gets us, further down into the remaining parts of our three-parter. But right now, in very large percentage of organizations out there, there is this entity operating called a project management office, a PMO. And even if it's not formally defined, there's generally something operating in the space that says, I know where all of the projects are, where their plans are, what lies have been told about them, how far along they are, etc.
And they're all successful.
And they're all successful, God knows, even if they are on the yellow light consistently for the last 36 weeks, that's okay. That's where we start. And we start with a cultural change. And that cultural change is taking out the notion that someone in the middle of all that mayhem somehow has control over each and every one of them. In general, most of the PMOs that I've seen, in particular in the federal space, are, to be perfectly honest, blunt, and unvarnished, they're rubber stamp machines. You walk in with your project plan, it gets thrown up on a screen, you talk about the various things that are comfortable to talk about, and you holler next. That culture change needs to take place inside of that function.
So you say the PMO has to change?
The PMO has to change, yes. And ultimately, the first thing I'd do is change its name, or if I don't have one formally, establish a new entity. Call it what you want. Obviously, I'd vote for DevOps office or DevOps coordinator or whatever. But there's two things that need to happen. The first is, culturally, we need to start looking across the table at one another and in unvarnished, candid, and very straightforward ways, bringing not what we think our masters expect, but bringing the truth. That's going to be the most difficult cultural change.
Wow, I would sign up for that one.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, just to watch.
It gets you the bonus.
No, I just
right?
I'm not going to. I just want a ticket to it.
The second proposition is to jettison the existing methodology and to reduce the scope and scale of the intended deliverables. Most authors and authorities that I've read suggest that that be done gradually. I'm of the opinion that it needs to be done very abruptly. In particular, I think you need to take one or two project teams, provide them with the necessary support and training so that they understand what the expectations of Agile are. Perhaps engage some external expertise in order for that process to be facilitated and turn them loose. I am also suggesting that within that new structure, DevOps office, DevOps coordinator, whatever you want to call it, that a new role come to fruition, come to being. And that role I call the evangelist. Back in the 90s, I actually pitched a venture group out of Palm Computing and had occasion to run into a number of people there and came to find that Palm Computing, which actually grew out of Apple, had a role within their organization called evangelist. They were extraordinary subject matter experts, extraordinary. They were extremely energetic, and they had the trust and the credibility necessary to operate within the organization. Those are the three things you're looking for in the evangelist role as you move your PMO to a DevOps, call it what you want.
So a couple of things here. I think a DevOps office is great. And so it's like you said, the repository of the things that you can do are all there. I don't see taking a couple of pilots, though, and making sure that we succeed on these pilots, right? We don't want incredible softballs, but it wouldn't be bad. That's not a bad way to start. Start on a pilot level. I thought you were going across the whole organization, we're going to go to DevOps, and that's the way we're going to do, because I've seen that approach, and it has been just a non-starter. But to take it as a say, listen, I got some really great candidates to run on those pilots, that would be really good.
Yeah. So, and I didn't mean to suggest that, the FAA take every project that they've got in place right now and immediately flip it to no. And I understand.
And thank you. I want to keep that on the record.
Yeah. The torches would come out and they'd find where I lived
and yeah, showers everywhere.
It just doesn't work like that. What I was suggesting was, in some instances, what authors have suggested is to take those projects that are presently in whatever state, call it waterfall, and to slowly move the deliverable process backwards. So if presently you're expected to deliver requirements in 6 months, then divide those requirements in half and deliver them in 3. And then subsequently divide them in half again and deliver them in a month and a half. And it just doesn't quite work like that. So no, you do want a vanguard.
So you've got your PMO as a great source. You've got your DevOps office. You pick out some pilots, some good candidates there. And I would suggest that you start from the beginning. If you've got some that are starting up, Doing some in the middle is painful. Now, I think the other thing you talk about is staffing. Evangelist is really good. By the way, that is a tough role to really fill. You got to have a real special person there. But staffing that DevOps office is also a really important function too.
Agreed. And one of the things that I point out, and it's a lesson that I learned from the experience at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, there are people right now, subject matter experts in business process analysis and business process engineering. Typically, they're Six Sigma black belt kinds of people. And they, first and foremost, bring an amazing capacity to the entire process. That's first. I had a commitment to business process in the past as an IT manager who's delivered applications. But I came to realize in working more closely with these people that if I deliver an application and I haven't altered a process in the process, then what I've delivered essentially is a very expensive toy. So there needs to be someone present who says, gee whiz, this software now takes several steps out of the process. It reorganizes several steps, and it includes several additional that bring the following value. That's what the business process person does. That is why they make exceptional evangelists, because they're accustomed to being everyone's enemy. They're accustomed to being the bad guy for the applications, for the user community as stakeholders, for the security folks. They stand in the middle and they arbitrate a tremendous number of conflicts and obstacles. And they're wonderful in the role of evangelist.
Love the evangelist. I like that role because you got to learn how to talk the talk.
And walk the walk.
And also, you've got to talk their language. If you don't, they're never going to hear you. But also that staffing, I think, has to be people that can take you being the project, take you and set you on the right course, help you understand what and how you should be delivering, and then check on and audit those projects as they go along.
And it's funny you use the word audit, because that brings us to kind of the final sort of step or stage in this. It's like we really haven't talked about the maturity models.
But that's a good point. Adopting a maturity model. Okay, so we've got a DevOps office. We've staffed it accordingly. And before that, we need to get a message out across the organization about what we're doing, why we're doing it, so people can understand what we're trying to accomplish, right?
Yes.
But also along that, we need to figure out, as you say, where are we at? Let's judge ourselves on where we're at and then figure out how well we're proceeding towards that goal we want to do.
Yes. So going back to the history sort of lesson, the one place that we never seemed to transit through as IT organizations was the idea that we need to separate what we do from the product itself. So for instance, if I make power tools as a manufacturer, I evaluate the drill that comes off the line by whether or not it's adopted by the marketplace, by whether or not it works, by whether or not. Great. But I also look at the manufacturing process that produced that drill independent of it.
You are so on this one.
So
it's amazing. It's like in applications, APM is mature, understood, appreciated, products out there that do amazing things, right? How did you make this product?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I did it as fast as I could. I'm on time, on budget. What's the next question?
So what's the next project?
Right. What's the next project? Because I think I succeeded. But when I bring that up with several people, they kind of give you the look like, well, that's the project manager's job. But really what we want to do, and I'm injecting words here, but visibility and transparency into the way we build our product.
Yes. And we don't want the success of a process to be dependent upon the presence of a specific individual. Now, we certainly want to hire, extraordinarily talented and well-versed and really great PMs. There's no two ways about it. But we should also have in place a capacity to evaluate how well we execute a specific process over and over again. how well that happens. The example that I give is while at Black & Decker, the realization came through that it took 60 months to design, develop, and deploy a compound miter saw. Now, it was a great saw, and ultimately it was something that the market adopted. But it doesn't take 60 months to design, develop, and deploy a car. Somehow it didn't make sense for that to happen with a compound miter saw. We took a look at the process and evaluated where it needed to change. It's not a matter of what it produced. It's a matter of how it was conducted and executed in and of itself. And we took about 36 months out of that process so that the next product did not take 60 months to design, develop, and deploy.
We are taking the same approach still these days in software.
We are.
And so we introduced in one particular case a dashboard that gave real-time data updates from each one of the components in the build process, the development process, the testing, the deployment, and could give you an assessment of quality and velocity. The question was, why would I ever want to know that right now?
Oh, jeez.
When really, and also they didn't realize, because of old habit, why am I looking at the application when I want to know how to build it? I'm like, wow, what you're looking at right now is how the bread is being baked here.
Yes. And then you need to ask the question, and it's the question that we always ask about computers and power tools. And that's when we hand it to people, am I enabling you to do stupid things faster? What I really want to do is I want to look at that process. I want to look at that dashboard, and I want to identify places where things aren't going right.
You got to identify the bottleneck.
Yes.
Based on KPIs.
Sure.
And we'll talk about that in the next podcast. But with those KPIs, understand where I'm not doing well. Drill down, get some problem resolution, and move it forward based on those metrics going towards where I want to be.
The two words you used, KPI and metric, are ultimately the key to at least part of this puzzle. And that's we need to measure, and we need to measure at a level of granularity that allows us insight into the process. That 2 points, time and budget, are just not sufficient to understand how a very complex process that ultimately produces an intangible product, how those parts fit together and ultimately produce the desired objective. We need measures. What you measure ultimately gets better.
Okay, so we don't want to get too far into your next one.
Okay.
But I've got a good one here for you. It's a good question.
They've all been good so far.
DevOps office and how it relates and reaches out to the rest of the organization.
That is an excellent question. And ultimately, here's what I say to you. The proposition of overlaying DevOps on the agile methodology is one in which you are attempting to drive a cultural change. Now, the DevOps office accomplishes that within the IT organization by bringing the various people around the table who are not used to being around the table with each other, by bringing them around the table and engaging them to understand that it's our project. It's our product. This is something we are all responsible for. But one of the things that I found really interesting about some of the enterprise architecture methodologies, for instance, TOGAF, for instance, is they have a statement within them that says explicitly that we are doing this to sustain and extend the cultural aspirations of the organization. And that is, in my humble estimation, exactly what DevOps is doing as well. So by bringing individuals from all throughout the organization, stakeholders, and, the early stages are ugly, and it's, sometimes hand-to-hand combat because these people aren't accustomed to speaking with one another across the table or seeing each other's processes or whatever.
It does take a special person to lead this group.
That evangelist is standing up with the black robe on in the pulpit. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and sometimes Martin Luther may have made it, but I think there was other ones before him that didn't do that well.
Indeed. So, when you take the job, you got to understand when you see the torches, you got to run.
So that's it for the second in our 3-part series. Why don't you give us a preview of what's next, but don't give away too much.
Okay. So given the fact that, you understand where you came from, given the idea that you need this maturity model to understand where you are and how you're going to get better, now what we need to put on top is a simple notion of here are the yardsticks. Now, there's more to it than simply that, because, ultimately you can go out on the internet right now and chase down all manner of DevOps metrics. But what no one quite tells you is, well, depending on where you are and how far you are and how well you do what you do now is what decides what metrics you adopt at that point. So we're going to get into that.
I got to tell you, and I'm going to go there again, is the relevancy of all of this, of where you start, okay, what it is, where I start, and how I take those first steps towards success is incredibly relevant to every customer we're talking to right now. So thanks for coming down.
The pleasure is mine.
We're looking forward to that third and final podcast in the series.
Fair enough. See you then.
The Agile Advocate is a production of Government CIO Media and Research. For more podcasts, head to governmentcio.com/podcasts. The Agile Advocate is produced by Amy Kluber. It is hosted by Bill Drew. Edited by Resonate Recordings. Theme music provided by Big Hoax. If you're interested in sponsoring a podcast, contact Joe O'Neill at JONEILL@governmentcio.com.